Um, yep, so like everyone said, I'm Katie Bowen, the Senior Environmental Scientist with Wildlands Conservancy. I'm going to be speaking about some examples of the types of work that we do, mostly based on our stream and floodplain restoration efforts. For those who aren't familiar, we are a nonprofit land trust working in the Lehigh Valley and the Lehigh River watershed. We work on a variety of conservation projects, trying to get the community connected to nature and help improve a lot of our natural resources. We work, like I said, primarily in the Lehigh River watershed. That's in the eastern portion of the state. So that does contain about 2,000 miles of streams. We have portions of 10 counties in there and work mainly within those areas, though we do sometimes work outside of that area as well. So we work on a pretty big variety of conservation efforts. A big part of our mission is around land protection. A lot of the properties that we protect, we do flip to a lot of state entities or sometimes federal. But we also do own and manage actually 12 nature preserves now. We also steward thousands of acres each year of wildlife habitat, both on our properties and working with public and private landowners. We do provide a lot of education and recreation programs for people in the community of all ages. We also have a trail department, so we work on connecting trails and greenways through a lot of the areas that we work as well. And we do all of this through partnerships, which is something that I'll be kind of highlighting throughout a lot of the presentation today. So I work in what's called our ecological restoration department. So we focus a lot on stream restoration and general habitat restoration as well. So my department, we work with both public and private landowners. I'll be speaking more to the public landowner projects that we work with today. Working to improve the health of streams on the property, address a lot of issues that some of these landowners might see on their properties. We employ a variety of restoration techniques in that effort. So we do a lot of plantings along streams. Sometimes when the issue is a little bit bigger, we do stream bank restoration. So I'll get into more of that later. We try to take a really wildlife habitat focused approach to some of these efforts. So while we're in there restoring the stream, trying to improve some of the habitat for terrestrial and aquatic species. We do remove dams as part of our stream restoration techniques and also work on implementing agricultural BMPs. So there are a lot of legacy issues kind of in our area, especially as it's become developed over time. And you see a lot of these where the stream side cares, kind of you have the improper management practices. So you see landowners channelizing the streams or hard armoring the banks, damming the streams up or mowing right up to the edge of the stream, allowing livestock in the waterways, things like that. And it's led to a lot of issues with erosion and flooding and sedimentation, especially in our Lehigh Valley area where we've seen a lot of development in floodplains. So these are a lot of the issues that we address in our work. I wanted to highlight stormwater since that's something that's been a growing issue in our area and kind of in general as storms become more frequent and severe. This is often a way to kind of frame the conversation with a lot of landowners that we found to be able to talk about proper streamside practices in preventing some of the severe impacts that we're seeing from stormwater, as a lot of these landowners are being impacted in ways that they weren't prepared to deal with when they, we often hear that someone moved along a little stream many years ago and now all of a sudden it's becoming this raging river that's flooding their property. So it's about trying to kind of address those impacts, and we take approach that's really about restoring the ecological function of this stream and naturalizing these areas to help, because you see a lot of the problem comes from this increase in impervious surfaces, and then we have fewer natural systems and less vegetation intact to kind of help hold that soil in place and absorb some of those floodwaters. So we're seeing a lot of flooding and erosion and consequently polluted runoff entering the streams, and that's causing a lot of degraded stream systems. We have a lot of impaired streams in our watershed, unfortunately, at this point. So focusing again on that stream and floodplain restoration, which I'll get into in a little bit, to kind of increase the resiliency of that system. So like I said, our focus is really on that ecological restoration component. I'll go into 3 areas that we tend to focus in our work. So the first is stream bank and habitat restoration. So addressing a lot of those severely eroded stream banks that we're starting to see, and kind of improving the in-stream habitat as well. As I mentioned, we do a lot with dam removal in our watershed, and then also with restoring those riparian buffer ecosystems and floodplains. So we work a lot with municipalities on these large-scale stream restoration projects, focusing on their public parks. We've been able to tackle a lot of large-scale issues. So we found, at least in our area, that many of these municipalities own large tracts of stream corridor, which is really great that they've been able to protect this stream in their parks. So we're able to have a really large scale benefit on these larger reaches of stream, which is great. And it's also really high visibility, so you get a lot of people coming through these areas. So it's an opportunity to educate the public about some of these issues and provide a model for what proper stream side practices are. It's also an opportunity to engage a lot of partners in an area. So working with those municipalities, a lot of times with their EACs, other conservation and community groups, and bringing in volunteers as well. So it's an opportunity to kind of more than just educating people, but engaging them in the process. And then it's also an opportunity to improve a lot of these spaces where we all spend time. So giving more opportunities to interact with nature and have a true green space, opportunities for fishing and wildlife viewing, which is really core to our mission. This is an example of a large-scale stream restoration project that we completed, partnering with the Martins-Jacoby Watershed Association. So this was actually a series of private landowners, but the same principles still apply, and I include it because this is kind of my extreme example of what happens when a lot of these issues go unaddressed for a long period of time. But basically, we had a lot of landowners either allowing crops or livestock right up to the edge of the streams, and this was on the Ohotton Creek, which is a direct tributary to the Delaware. So getting pretty severe erosion issues. There was no buffer to hold the stream banks in place, and seeing it cut down. And we ended up in some areas with 30-foot banks, which you can kind of see in the top right. And just these landowners really weren't able to address this issue at this point. It was pretty intimidating. They were losing property every year. And we also were seeing a lot of flooding impacts. The stream would move around a lot in the channel, and then at one point it started jumping the banks in severe floods, and you can see on the bottom left, it would kind of head straight across the farm field into someone's house, and it would flood them out pretty badly. So we were seeing a lot of issues that way, and this stream, it seems pretty tame when it's flowing normally, but during storms it gets very flashy, and the size of the material that it was moving, it would move pretty large boulders, so it was moving a lot of sediment as well, picking it up from these banks and causing a lot of sedimentation in the Delaware, which was a pretty big issue. So that was something that we definitely wanted to address, keeping that sediment in place and preventing a lot of those pollutants from entering the waterways. So we came in last year, and we had plans to basically kind of grade back a lot of those banks and install in-stream structures. So you can see kind of on the bottom right there where the banks had been laid back and revegetated, and then we had volunteers in to come in and plant kind of as that final component of holding those banks in place long term. So again, just kind of focusing on a really natural solution, not hard armoring anything, kind of installing in-stream either stone or log deflectors to protect the banks long term. And we actually luckily or unluckily, were able to kind of test this out right after they finished this section. Luckily, they'd gotten it all kind of buttoned up, but we had the hurricane hit last year, so that was kind of our first big test of our structures, and it held up really well, so we were really pleased with that. And luckily, it didn't all get washed out, so kind of really helpful in the future. And again, focusing that conversation on the landowners, that you give up some space for crops or livestock on the front end, but you lose less property over time because you're not having that floodwater, cutting in every year. This is another example of a project we have. This is working with a municipality, Lehigh Township, on one of their parks. So they have a lot of legacy issues where they'd actually poured a lot of concrete through the park to really channelize the stream a long time ago, and it's since has become an issue as we've started to see much more severe flooding. So they've started to get a lot of that concrete is actually collapsing in the stream. You can see here on the bottom that they had a pedestrian bridge, and a lot of that concrete is actually collapsed into the stream, and they had to rope that off as a public safety concern. So really having severe impacts to infrastructure as well. Up here, they have the township's historical society is in this building, and part of the foundation is along the stream. And again, that's starting to get undermined by a lot of this flooding, just because the stream is so channelized and eroded that it's just continuing to erode, and it doesn't have anywhere to kind of spread out in its floodplains. So we'll be addressing that this summer. Again, kind of a similar approach of grading the banks a bit and putting in-stream structures at strategic points to kind of keep that flow in the center of the channel. And then we'll be planting as well in the park to kind of address a lot of these issues and prevent a lot of that continued erosion and sedimentation in that waterway. We have some upcoming projects I can highlight that are really specific to the MS4 program, which is just starting to get implemented in our area now. Two projects in Northampton County where we're working. This one is with Plainfield Township. So we'll be implementing basically their entire PRP, so that's 1,600 linear feet of stream bank restoration and stabilization, focused around their trail. They have a recreation trail that runs along the stream. And in a lot of these areas, we're starting to see erosion, and the trail is starting to become undermined. So addressing a lot of those issues, this is one site. We'll be implementing one site this summer, and then the remainder will be next year. But where we're starting to see, again, a lot of the erosion, it's kind of starting to work its way around the bridge, which puts that in danger. We have some trees that are in danger of collapsing. So looking at some different strategies for really naturalizing a lot of these areas and installing log vanes and deflectors and things like that. And again, grading those banks back and planting to kind of allow that system to function a little better, more naturally. And this one is a little bit different. This one we're on pretty early stages. It's with East Allen Township, but they basically have, it's about a 24-acre parcel that they added to their property. They had permanently protected it. It was agricultural fields that are now fallow. We're starting to see kind of some invasives pop up that we'll have to deal with. But basically, it's kind of just an open area, and you have a stream channel running through, and through the creation of their PRP, it was determined that it's contributing a lot of sediment to this tributary and then to downstream areas. So looking at kind of a combination of different things. So we'll have some more traditional stormwater infrastructure for capturing some of that sediment and allowing that to settle out in some ponds and wetland areas. And then the majority of the area, it's pretty cool. We have a plan to kind of naturalize the whole space in meadow and wetland and buffer plantings. And we have planned trails throughout the area, and it's an opportunity to have a lot of signage and educational programs as well to really get people familiar with the concepts of naturalizing these spaces and dealing with stormwater in a different way. So this is a really unique opportunity to kind of take sort of a blank canvas and turn it into something really cool that functions as really good habitat for a lot of declining species as well. So another topic that we focus a lot on with our stream restoration efforts is dam removal. This is something that has been, we've been doing this for the past few decades. We've actually removed more than 25 dams from the watershed, and it's something that's gained a lot of more momentum in more recent years because it can provide so many benefits to the streams. And especially with the flooding we're seeing, dams really tend to exacerbate a lot of those issues. But in our watershed, there are dams on the Lehigh River and each of its major tributaries. So we're talking about hundreds of dams within our watershed. And most of these structures are now obsolete and are actually degrading the stream systems that they're in. So they provide a lot of water quality impacts. So they create kind of a large impoundment where they tend to slow the flow of the water and disrupt that natural hydrology. And within that impoundment, you see increased temperature and a lot of sediment buildup, which kind of gets flushed out during flooding events. And you see a lot of oxygen decrease and habitat decrease within that impoundment as well. And then over time, the stream wants to get around these structures, so it starts to kind of erode the channel upstream from these areas. So you see a wider and wider channel and a lot of erosion and sedimentation of downstream areas. They also act as a barrier to fish species, both migratory fish and some of our resident fish as well, that need to be able to move through these waterways. And they also present a public safety concern. The landowners are liable for any damages that might come from something happening to the structure or to people. People tend to want to play on these structures. Though we see as they degrade, a lot of these were built kind of haphazardly, and we see, rebar or sharp pieces of metal sticking out. So it becomes a concern for a lot of landowners, which is why a lot of the public landowners decide to remove the dams on their properties. And restoration of free-flowing conditions opens up these waterways for a lot of opportunities for fishing and kayaking and things like that, which is why we've targeted this as a strategy. So I'll go through an example. This was a pretty large-scale project that we completed in 2019. This was actually up in the headwaters of Lehigh River, up in Wayne and Lackawanna counties. This was, we call it the Klondike Dam, but we have a pretty long history with the property where we were actually able to protect this property. It's about 500 acres, really special property. It's now been flipped over to the Game Commission and turned into state game lands. So we wanted to continue kind of our efforts with this property. There was a large dam that impounded about 30 some acres of water. And this whole area used to be, completely filled in and had been dug down many years ago. It was originally an ice dam, and they're not using it for anything by the time we came along. So the landowner had received a letter from DEP saying that the dam was failing and that they needed to either remove it or repair it. At this point, they weren't prepared to do either. Both are very expensive. So we had kind of stepped in once the Game Commission came in, and it had been partially breached at that time. So some of this impoundment was a little bit drained, and the area had been sort of a lot of the sediment that had built up, we're talking about feet of sediment near the dam, had been stabilized and had kind of revegetated naturally just with the seed bed that had been buried. So by the time we came along and removed it, the area wasn't quite as full of water, which helps out with we don't have so much to drain at that point. But we were able to remove the dam. So we're talking about weeks and weeks of just breaking up concrete and digging down through the earthen berm that had been created to kind of so on the bottom here create that new channel through the former dam here. That's where they dug down and created a stable channel. These two pictures were a year later in the fall after the dam had been removed and the area had really revegetated.
Different things for him all done in here. So
I'm trying to
necessarily at level 4 or something, but so it puts it in the inspection meetings. That's kind of across the board everything. So then what
I don't know if someone can mute their
just trying to find it, or if I'm not here, or if let's hand it off to somebody else. they know where to find it, that I'm putting it in a location that they can get to it. If I just put it on my U drive, they see.
Okay, there we go. Anyway, yep, so then the area had kind of revegetated, and we got sort of postponed because of COVID, but basically had big plans to plant within this former impoundment targeting woodcock habitat. So we were able to plant this spring thousands of native seedlings targeting that ground nesting habitat. And I'm hoping that this is going to work. Just have some video footage we took at various stages. Let's see here. Yep, so this was actually before the dam was removed, so you can see what I was talking about had been partially drained. They started to kind of drain this before construction, so there's still a lot of sediment that's kind of not stabilized, and the stream channel was still kind of moving around within this impoundment, though large areas had kind of revegetated at this point. You'd still see kind of large areas of standing water, but this is the size, just to give you an example, an idea of how big this area was. That was all underwater, and this is kind of the upstream area, which was pretty nice. And then this was during construction. You can see they broke up a lot of the concrete, and then kind of just digging down through that berm to kind of, this was where the channel eventually ended up being. And this was a year later. So this would have been 2020 before we planted, but after the area had really revegetated, you can see it really had formed that stable channel through the former impoundment at this point, and a lot of it had vegetated. We had a lot of really cool native species popping up, which was nice to see, and kind of forming that channel through the former impoundment, which is where we targeted a lot of plantings along the stream to provide shade, because the impoundment had actually been warming the stream up 3 or 4 degrees when it was all underwater, which was quite a lot during the summer. So wanted to kind of target cooling that down a bit. So this is another project we did several years ago with the city of Allentown. This is a little bit smaller scale. We had kind of a series of dams through their park and different structures that were impacting the flow of the stream and causing, again, a lot of erosion and flooding issues within the park during storm events, kind of really degrading the water quality. So you'd see this was kind of the impoundment where you had that kind of slow moving water that was often full of debris or algae and things like that, and really not the nicest area to be around. So we did come in and remove a lot of those structures at that point, worked on restoring that far bank, so the floodplain, so kind of regrading that and addressing a lot of the erosion issues in the park, and creating, you can see over time as it starts to revegetate, and now it's this really nice area that when it floods or when there's a storm, it can kind of spread out through this vegetated area, and it allows it to really absorb a lot of that water instead of causing a lot of that erosion, and allowing it to kind of infiltrate. And we did some planting in that area as well, which has grown up a lot since then. And then the final strategy that I'll talk about that we work with a lot of municipalities on is riparian buffers. These areas are so important for our stream systems, for the health of the stream in terms of habitat for wildlife and fish, in terms of water quality, and it's something that's been largely removed from our waterways. The practice has really been to mow kind of right up to the edge of the stream, which is really not providing any of those benefits for the streams, and it's causing a lot of impacts from that erosion, and it's also expensive to keep mowing and manicuring, and it really doesn't provide any benefits for wildlife. So we've been really focused on kind of restoring a lot of these areas to improve our waterways and address a lot of those stormwater impacts. We've taken a regional approach to this effort. A lot of our efforts have been focused on Lehigh Valley so far, though we do have some sites up north as well. So we had actually undertaken a large-scale mapping effort, looking first at the Lehigh Valley, so looking at all the streams within the Lehigh Valley, looking at the existing land cover and kind of infrastructure. So identifying basically all the areas that could be planted along our streams and kind of compiling that. And we created a mapping tool, which has been made available to all of our partners and the municipalities in the area. We had that through grant funding through our conservation landscape with DCNR. So that's something that's been really useful, both for partners to kind of identify new project areas and for tracking a lot of our progress. And we tend to have funding through DCNR, through their Riparian Buffer grant program. So we're able to provide a lot of technical assistance in project management and funding to public landowners. We work, they provide basically the space along the streams in public parks, and then we kind of come in with funding and are able to work on each component. So putting together a planting plan and designing the best approach for the stream there. We try to engage a lot of partners in these areas. We've had a lot of success working with EACs, watershed associations, chapters of Trout Unlimited, and a lot of community environmental organizations. And then so in 2017, when DCNR did create that funding program, is when we really began to be able to focus on buffers again, kind of as a separate component. And that's something that we felt really fortunate that there's so much funding available for that. And we've actually been able to plant on more than 50 acres throughout the watershed since 2017, mostly with public landowners, which has been a really nice effort. I do just want to highlight that education is a really critical component of projects like this, both with the landowners and the public, because we see that landowners don't always connect the problem with the solution. So we see, again, a lot of those poor management practices, and they tend to lead to that flooding and erosion. And it's how, the park's always been managed, or with private landowners, how they've always, managed their yard. And it started to lead to property damage. And then you see a lot of the attempted fixes tend to exacerbate the issue or push it downstream. So you'll see people dumping riprap or rocks, or installing gay-bean baskets, and either the stream tends to kind of just keep eroding right around that rock, or it tends to push the problem downstream for a little while. So maybe it's the neighbor's problem, or it's a problem, further downstream in the park. And so, we've been able to come in and address a lot of those issues through plantings, where you have the deeper root systems, which is really the only thing that's going to hold all that soil in place. And you need kind of a diversity of the trees and the shrubs and a lot of herbaceous species. You see typical grass has a really shallow root system. It's not holding any soil in place. And so that's really not going to be the best solution for kind of having your vegetation right next to the stream. So we have worked with a lot of different municipalities on these efforts. These are a couple of examples. A lot of these municipalities were doing a really great job of naturalizing some of these spaces on their own, but needed help, kind of with that technical assistance component and funding component. So we were able to come in and plant, in all of these spaces, again, addressing a lot of those erosion and flooding concerns that they're having in the parks, and plant throughout these areas. And I'll stress that this, for us, is not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's something that, we take into account the existing space and the land uses and sort of the needs for the parks. So it might look different depending on where you are. But I look at it as an opportunity, yes, to educate people about the importance of these buffers, but also to show that we actually have a lot of really beautiful native species, and it can add a lot of really great color and diversity to the landscape. And it's an opportunity to view more wildlife and benefit the stream. So it's something that is kind of different depending on where you go. This is an example of a pretty large-scale planting project we did, which involved a few components, working with Lower Macungie Township. So they had actually protected about a mile of stream along the Little Lehigh Creek. And this property was a pretty big area, so they put in trails and they'd done some work with meadows and things like that. But we're still seeing issues with some erosion and some sedimentation, especially from some nearby farm fields. So, we came in with additional funding for plantings, and we were able to plant, a few hundred trees along the stream. to really kind of establish and expand the existing buffer and really improve that habitat and stream corridor. This is another similar example with Whitehall Township, where they'd completed a new section of a greenway through Allentown, and then we basically came in, and it had a very narrow buffer along the Jordan Creek, so we came in and planted between the trail and the buffer, which provided an opportunity to engage a lot of volunteers in the effort, and also put out signage, so every time someone's passing by on the trail, they can kind of read about the project. We were able to plant more than 200 trees during this effort. I'll stress, as I've been saying, education is a really important component, so engaging the public throughout this process is been really important. Luckily, people love planting trees, so that's something that, it's absolutely great to see volunteers out there and see them kind of connect the importance of what they're doing with the health of the stream. We also do project tours and educational outreach kind of before, during, and after these projects, and we have signage, so on the right side is an example of some of our and then a lot of these projects, especially with these planting projects, it provides an opportunity to leverage a lot of existing funding and work and combine it with a lot of different projects. So we've had a lot of success kind of stringing together different funding sources and different project types and kind of leveraging those and kind of maximizing the impact that we can have on these stream corridors. So working on kind of having planting as that final component that holds all the pieces in place, whether we're doing in-stream restoration or floodplain restoration, invasive species work, developing trails, and it can help to satisfy MS4 requirements as well. And then my final example here of some of our efforts to leverage funding. So we were working with Bethlehem Township on a pretty big area of stream through their park. So we had originally kind of just planned to have plantings, but then in this downstream area, but then they had sort of a lot of issues with erosion in the upstream areas where you see, again, that practice of mowing right up to the edge. They had dumped rock in at one point, so they were seeing a lot of erosion of those banks and a lot of flooding, kind of just acres and acres of mowed grass in the downstream area. So we had actually have since planted this area. And then the upstream area, sort of here, you see a lot of the flooding and the spreading out here of the water that kind of ponds for a few days, and you get geese, which kind of contribute other water quality issues there. This will be addressed this summer. But again, you see the widening of that channel, and it continues to erode, and it impacts the trail right next to it, and you're getting a lot of sediment getting washed down through this area. So this will be kind of that similar approach of laying back the banks a bit, creating more open area for that water, and doing a lot of planting. So kind of changing that landscape. And then this is that downstream area where we planted a couple years ago. So we got some trees established along the trail to provide a little bit of shade, and then focused on more of like a wet meadow planting through the park, which has added a lot of color. This was in the first year. It kind of changes each year a little bit. We have a little more color variety this year, but kind of adding a lot of diversity to a park that really was just acres and acres of mowed grass. So, signage and education was an important component, but it's certainly kind of diversified that landscape a little bit as people are walking around. And then this was just my last slide to show kind of the typical roles that we take in these projects where we're partnering with municipalities, where we're kind of managing the project and writing grants to secure the funding, and then, conducting that grant administration and helping with providing technical expertise and things like that to manage each step of the project, and then working closely with the municipality who are involved to kind of provide input through that process. And then a lot of the times our partners are really useful. They're helpful in securing approval from landowners, and since they're kind of the local eyes and ears, they know the area and the community really well, so they can help support the project in various stages, and assisting with volunteer engagement and sometimes some of our planting events. So that's kind of what I had there. Happy to answer any questions or anything like that.
Wow, Kate, that was incredible. A lot of great slides and great projects. Just a wide array of really interesting solutions there, from dam removal to riparian buffers to education. I love the what's growing on here educational sign. Do we have any questions out there? Feel free to type them in the chat box. If you want to ask your question live, you can raise your hand. I think, Liz, do we need to unmute people if they want to ask? I think we may
No, they
need
can
to,
go ahead. They can
but
unmute themselves.
okay, so you can either type it in the chat box or unmute yourself. While people are thinking, I'll just ask a question here. How is your organization funded? Um, do you are, I think you said you started in the mid 70s. Are you funded kind of year to year, or do you have kind of a legacy pot of money that you operate on? How do you guys maintain?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's sort of a mishmash, but yeah, we rely a lot on donations from the public. We're very fortunate to have a really great donor community. We do have sort of endowments, especially with a lot of the properties we've taken to be managing those properties. And then like my department's entirely grant funded. So we rely on, grants to kind of help out with our time there. So it's sort of a mix.
Okay, and we did have a question in the chat box. The map of riparian buffer opportunities didn't have as many dots as they thought it would. Were these opportunities limited to the municipally owned lands?
Oh, sorry. That map was actually just all the areas we've planted. I didn't pop up the map that showed the opportunity areas, but there are many opportunity areas in the valley. So yeah, I realized that was a little bit confusing, but it's not really dots. It's like kind of like a whole. It's raster data, which is so it's kind of areas that are shaded throughout the valley. But there are several. I think that's several thousand areas that are available for planting.
Okay. Other questions or comments? Here's one here. Can municipalities get MS4 credits for dam removal projects?
So that's something I'm actually really interested. I don't have an exact answer to that. We haven't unfortunately been able to pursue that as an MS4 opportunity, but it's something that I'd like to speak with DEP about. I know they're very supportive of dam removal in general, and I imagine that this is a strategy that could be included in sort of the planning process, working with an engineer to show how it reduces sort of that sediment component. I imagine that this is something that could be included, though we haven't had the opportunity to do it ourselves.
Yeah, I would think if you can show significant erosion at the outlet, it should be pretty easy to work up a justification for that.
Yeah.
How do
Hey,
oh, go ahead.
can I interrupt for a second? This is
Sure.
Jamie from DEP. Just a note on that on dam removal. So if for just specifically removing a dam, there's no sediment reduction that can be associated with that. But a lot of times it sounds like what you're doing is really kind of a comprehensive restoration that happens to include a dam removal. Is that, I see you nodding your head there. Yeah, so if you have a project that really is a stream restoration, that's certainly something that we can credit. But if it's, so it really does depend on the scope of the project. So if you have a site that you're thinking of working on that does include that, yeah, definitely reach out to your DEP regional office and talk about what you're thinking of for the project.
Yeah, that's really good to know.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Yeah.
We're just about out of time. One quick final question here. How would a municipality engage with your organization for a potential project?
Yeah, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact info is up on the screen. I'm happy to talk to anyone about partnership opportunities. We're always looking for new projects and new partnerships. So please do reach out.
Very good. Well, thanks again, Kate, and thanks to everyone for attending. Very interesting set of projects there. Our next session, our final session for the workshop, starts at 12:10. So please do attend so you can click on the link for the evaluation survey. Thanks again for attending, and we'll see you in about 4 minutes.